I used to sit in the library reading this ancient text about demon possessions and exorcisms and magical healings, and I was doing serious work. I was writing footnotes. I was getting letters after my name, and I thought that what I was studying history. Of course, I was reading the New Testament. I was preparing to be a Bible scholar, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to ask the obvious question, what would I call it if I found this in any other ancient text? If I found any other ancient text about flying angels and exorcisms and all that sort of thing, what would I call that text? I would call it mythology. But because it was the New Testament, I called it a historical source. Nobody ever said the word myth. And I want to tell you why that is. And I think the answer is more disturbing and more interesting than you might even think. And it comes from one key move in biblical studies. We wrote the rules for our own field. And we often treat the Bible very differently than we treat any other text. Here's why. In Acts chapter 19, there's this famous example of this high priest named Sceva who has 7 sons. And these 7 sons realize that they can exorcise demons in the name of Jesus. So they try to do it, and this guy who has a demon jumps on them and beats the crap out of them. And then all the residents of Ephesus are so amazed that they burn their magical books, and this is why people get mad at Paul. And later on in the same chapter, there's this word, this title from Asia Minor called an Asiarch, and this is an actual title that we see in inscriptions. And what I have to deal with is people saying that because that word Asiarch is in the book of Acts, we need to take the whole thing seriously as eyewitness history. Like, seriously, we need to stop and take an exorcism seriously as eyewitness history. Who is doing this? How the heck did we build institutions that you could even get away with this? I have my friend Richard C. Miller to thank for this because he has said this to me a few times and it's really sunk in, that Western biblical scholarship has created an entire discipline that is dedicated towards maintaining and validating its own mythology. That's essentially what Bible scholars often end up doing. So I was talking about Richard C. Miller's ideas and I decided maybe I'll give him a call and see what he thinks. Hey, good. How are you doing?
Doing all right.
Do you have a minute?
Sure.
And I was thinking about this going right back to Rudolf Bultmann. Rudolf Bultmann is like one of the top early biblical scholars of the last century. And Rudolf Bultmann developed this idea for demythologizing the New Testament. And it came from this idea that you could just kind of strip away the mythological aspects, which, okay, like if we're talking about exorcisms, I'm not totally opposed to that. But he had this idea that you could just strip away mythology and the kernel of history is underneath. Behind the mythology, there's this historical core that's recoverable and you can get it back. And this has been something kind of stable in biblical scholarship. This has been something we often just assume, that if you strip away the myth, you can get to this historical core underneath. And it's wild to me when I come to engage with modern apologists who also want the book of Acts, for example, let's stick with that example, who also want the book of Acts to be considered as like 100% eyewitness history. And you actually have a very similar thing. Not to dump on Bultmann because he was a really good scholar. Nobody agrees with everything he does, but there's no question that he founded a lot of the things we think about in our field. But when you come to apologetics, they actually have a very similar approach. They just basically say much less is mythology. So basically, everybody from Bultmann to New Testament scholars right through to apologists see or believe that there's a historical kernel behind any individual book in the New Testament, a gospel, Acts, whatever. And what you can do is understand to what extent is myth and what's left over is history. And for the apologists, they would say probably almost none of it is myth. And for Bultmann, he said a lot of it was myth. But there's actually this remarkable stable core across biblical studies that is the assumption that there is history. There's history behind whatever else is here. You can get to history, and these are useful books for writing history. Now, this could be a reasonable approach, and I'm certainly open to using any ancient book as a historical source. But what's happened specifically in my field of biblical studies is we make the rules. And when we make the rules, and we do this in Western institutions, creating rules that justify and preserve and prioritize our own kind of Western Christian, especially even Protestant epistemology, what happens is we create this bizarre Frankenstein of a discipline. And that's what biblical studies is. And it's just mind-boggling to me that after 200 years of biblical studies or whatever it's been, that we're still in these conversations about how there's an eyewitness in Acts, and therefore this exorcism must have really happened. even a lot of Christian churches wouldn't put up with that. If you walked into a church today, like how many of your churches in your town could you walk into and say, there's this guy down the street who tried to exorcise somebody in the name of Jesus, and that guy jumped on him and beat the crap out of him? Most churches would still have you committed. Like, this is not something that we even consider happens, yet for some reason when we're talking about our sacred myths, we don't tend to actually examine this stuff. If you actually look at how we study the Bible, and maybe even look like more broadly about how we study religions, because this is an important critique that a lot of religious studies scholars have made as well, you'll see something that virtually we made the rules around studying the Bible or studying religions. And the rules that were created by biblical studies, religious studies departments, in many ways were rules that were created so that we could imprint our own ideas and keep our myths unique. We actually created the methodology for studying our own myths that we could use to actually keep it really unique. So for example, in biblical studies, we always use the historical critical method. It's a very common way of approaching texts. And we might just say that that is a legitimate approach to studying religion. But if you really stop and think about it, this comes from a specific European epistemology, and doing historical critical study is the gatekeeper for a whole bunch of different kind of ways that we prioritize knowledge, that we prioritize which religions we can actually even study. So for example, we're saying if historical study is a legitimate way to study religion, we're saying that religion has to be text-based. And this, for example, is a notorious problem because we know Zoroastrianism had impacts on Judaism, but they didn't really write that much down. So what happens when you're trying to study history with the historical critical study is we say, geez, that looks like what we think we know about Zoroastrianism. But because we have these extensive written records for Judaism in a way that we don't have for Zoroastrianism, a lot of scholars are forced to say, well, Judaism might have come first, or Judaism must have been unique because we don't have any other records. So like the mere fact that we study texts, the mere fact that our discipline is formed around studying texts and prioritizing texts already shapes the way that we can understand the past and how we actually construct knowledge about the past. We know Zoroastrianism had an enormous impact on Jewish thought, but scholars will point out we can't prove it. Why can't we prove it? Because they didn't write anything down. So our assumptions about method and historiography actually shape what's possible in history. And just by making the historical critical method the focus of how we do history or comparative history in antiquity, we end up prioritizing our traditions that wrote things down. That's just one example. So we built the field, we made the rules, and because of that, we get to decide what's a legitimate aspect of study. I was kind of thinking through some of the ways we do this, like essentially the way that biblical studies has actually been formulated specifically to defend a Western myth. And I was thinking, for example, about some of our methods. So, things like, even like conversations about eyewitnesses or conversations about chain of apostolic authority, things like that. Like, these are not things you would find in any other historical field. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the problem is you might find something like that in regular history work, but it would be super fringe. It would be on the bell curve, far off the natural center. And so, but the problem is in the natural selection of our field, the methodologies and kind of odd ways that we go about biblical studies end up being naturally selected because it's the West funding the legitimation of its own mythology. Everything is just gravitationally pulled toward these kind of apologetic mechanisms and tooling and stuff that is unnatural really to the central tool chain of normal history work and historiology and this kind of thing.
And it's interesting coming back to this word mythology, because I said we don't use the word myth to study Christian texts. I will probably get pushback just for using it. Now, I've said before that my definition of myth goes something like a larger-than-life origin story. That's kind of the way I think about mythology. And it's not to say there's no historical kernel there. Whatever, there could be. But we even use this category of myth to gatekeep and to preserve and prioritize our own sacred knowledge. So, for example, if I, like many people in the history of religion school have done, point out that there's a lot of similarities between Christianity and a Greek mystery cult, we all of a sudden can put in all of these breaks to kind of set Greek mystery cults off as being weird and unique. They're too interested in mythology. They're too esoteric. They're too creepy. They're too spooky and underground. Christianity wasn't any of those things. Too often scholars have made a distinction between Christianity and Greek mystery cults because Greek mystery cults are weird. And Christianity, as far as we can tell, because we're used to it, isn't weird. I mean, a lot of people in antiquity thought it was, but we tend to not think it was. Or, for example, you could look at the many similarities between Christianity and the emperor cult, the cult of emperor worship. And what happened, now this is not the case anymore, but what happened for a really long time is people looked at the similarities and how the emperors, how the Roman emperors were worshipped as sons of God, or Dei Filius in Latin. People would look at this figure and say, that can't be the same as Christianity, because Christians actually meant it. People who worshiped the emperor were doing it because they had to. But when Christians worshiped Jesus, they actually meant it. So again, just the way that we approach history and the way that we set apart categories can help us prioritize and preserve our religion as being something unique, our own mythology as being something exceptional, and the behavior of early Christians as being something that nobody else was apparently doing, which is just ridiculous. And when I look at how the field of biblical studies studies antiquity and the resistance to comparing to other things in antiquity, it's really amazing how we've created a field that makes us special and makes our religion special. People will look at other religions in antiquity and say, they can't be like Christianity, they were too weird, or they were too supernatural. Christianity was a little less supernatural, and they were too supernatural. They were too esoteric, or they were not esoteric enough. In so many different ways, when you look at how scholars study the history of religions, especially in antiquity, you see that they constantly are inventing ways for why Christianity deserves special treatment, why there should be a different set of rules that we apply to Christian practice and Christian texts. And not surprisingly, you still have a lot of even biblical studies departments out there today that will argue that Christianity was unique. Now, to some extent, every religion is unique. Every social group is unique, sure. But what happens if you created the discipline and you create the rules, you end up creating your religion as being the thing that is unprecedented. And that, I think, is a huge mistake. And coming back to the story of this high priest and his 7 sons who performed an exorcism, I think there's this really dark and really colonial impulse that's still written into much of biblical studies that our myths are worthy of serious historical inquiry and engagement in a way that others aren't. We would look at other ancient myths and maybe put them in an anthropology class, or I'd have it like a Greco-Roman mythology class to study stories that look exactly like Christianity, but those you would study in a biblical studies department and study them as history. And it's weird when you look at how biblical scholarship has been able to make up its own rules of engagement, virtually make up its own discipline. You realize that biblical scholarship does history in a way that nobody else really does history. In order to get history from our documents, in order to study these myths as if they are history, we have to create different categories of doing history that don't actually make a lot of sense with comparanda. Like, they don't actually work with other historiographical approaches. So, for example, how often do we talk about eyewitnesses? Like, I so often hear things about eyewitnesses, books and journal articles, and people now in my YouTube comments trying to tell me that the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses. Acts is written by eyewitnesses. Now, we could argue about whether or not that's true, but the real question is, why do we have a discipline even looking for eyewitnesses? What other historians of antiquity, what other historians of like past centuries are looking for eyewitnesses of things? It sounds really good. It sounds like something that's a really important thing to do, and it sounds like a way to get accurate history, but it's actually not something anybody else is looking for. No other historian that I am aware of looks for eyewitnesses, or at least not in quite the same way. So much so that we go picking apart these ancient claims about eyewitnesses, which did happen outside of the Gospels too. But again, this is like rhetoric. It's rhetorical tropes. This is the way that eyewitnesses were used and constructed and manufactured in a way in antiquity for people writing mythology to signal that what they were writing was accurate, or sometimes for history as well. I've worked in other fields of history. Actually, my undergraduate was in Canadian and American history. And in that field, I don't ever remember really thinking about eyewitness testimonies. Like, maybe sometimes you get primary sources or something, but we weren't obsessed about finding eyewitness testimonies. This is an obsession of biblical scholars. And it's weird. It sounds historical. It sounds good, but it's something Bible scholars are obsessed with. Bible scholars are also obsessed with chains of transmission. This idea of like ideological purity, that we need to know how things go back to the apostles and figure out who passed things on to who, and make sure like we get this clean transmission chain of this idea goes back to Paul or Jesus or to the original apostles. or this book of the Bible has connections to the original apostles. But who actually cares about that? Chain of transmission, as far as I know, is not really historical methodology. This is mythology posing as history. And I don't really know a lot of historians that are obsessed about chains of transmissions. And these are just two examples, but these are the ways that we've made up this really weird field that feels academic and scholarly, but it's full of all these bizarre things that we don't find anywhere else. And it's kind of a sign that we've actually created this around our modern faith propositions and our modern beliefs, and the way that we want to live in these stories, the way that we want these stories to affect our religion. Essentially, coming back to what Richard C. Miller says, we've cultivated and studied and become guardians and transmitters and preservers of our own mythology. And by the way, one of the things that I find interesting as somebody who does this on YouTube is the amount of time that people have emotional outbursts by me asking questions. If I ask a question like, did the earliest Christians believe the resurrection? I did one on this a few weeks ago. People are angry. Now, I mean, as a religious person, as somebody who grew up in that religion, I understand the anger. But the really weird thing about that for me is it's actually religious anger posing as historiographical outrage. Because people will be mad at me to say, like, we have X source, we know such and such. Why would you ask this question? We have this church father that says this. People get so angry and so emotional and then try to pretend they're studying history. This is not the study of history. The study of history is not me having an emotional outburst when I don't get back to the original answer, when I ask a question that violates the thing I want to believe about something. This is religion. This is just one more example of how so many people think they're doing history and they're actually guardians of a mythology, and yet we don't use the word mythology. How does history actually work? Maybe material evidence, corroborating sources. We question interests and biases. We might look at any historical text as having useful information in it, but there's no way that we would ever look at a historical text and say like one or two accurate details indicates that the whole thing is trustworthy. These are like the bizarre methods that people have created to study the Bible, and it's not doing history. It's driven by modern faith needs. This high priest and his sons from Asia Minor, we tell ourselves, must have actually tried to cast out a demon, because a little while later, there's this accurate historical figure. That's not actually history. We've created a system that privileges and prioritizes our myths, that gives our myths the benefit of the doubt, that treats our myths, it's hard to say myths this many times in a row, but it treats them with these fake historical approaches. It makes us feel like we're doing something good. But then there's something else we do at the same time that biblical studies does as well, is that we're always creating the other. We invent the myths of the other. Jews were different. Jews were set apart. They were more careful. They had more serious rules they were more serious about. And meanwhile, Greeks and Romans believed all these weird stuff. And we use pantheism and polytheism as codes for like gullible. And then we look at people who are monotheistic as if they're more rational or more discerning. Even sometimes when we step into comparative mythology, we're quick to argue about why ours is different. I don't know how many times I've heard people comparing, for example, the Genesis creation stories to Babylonian creation stories and then saying, oh, but theirs is so violent, ours is nicer, or something like that. Like, we're always doing this kind of separating and fencing off of our own stories to make sure that we treat them differently, as unique. We end up pretending that our myth doesn't actually fit in the same category. Now, this move actually reminds me of a scholar, Edward Said, who wrote this amazing book, Orientalism. And what Said argues in Orientalism is that the West doesn't actually just study the East. It produces the East as a category. The scholar's gaze is never just neutral. The scholars, and he was critiquing people in the last century, but it's still wildly true as far as I can tell, scholars would often create this thing of like Oriental or Eastern thought, or in our case, if we're thinking about like the ancient Near East or the Greco-Roman world. And then we would establish Western rationality as the norm against which everything else gets measured. And everything else by comparison would be considered exotic or primitive or irrational. Is this not exactly what happens in biblical studies? Isn't this exactly what happens when we try to study the Gospels and Acts as historical stories and then turn around and pretend that other things that look like them are the myths, that we don't have the myths, other people have the myths?
So I used Edward Said's, like, the ideas from Orientalism. I was thinking about it in terms of how we create the other in antiquity. So like Christianity can't be like Greek mystery cults because they're too weird and they're too esoteric, and our religion's a little more serious and sober. We've often created these differences in degrees and types that create the other, I think, in antiquity as well.
Yeah, that's right. There's almost this, again, it's apologetic effort to try and find this sui generis beginning, this inbreaking of God, as Karl Barth proposed in history, that should have no real comparison a whole lot, believer stage or cult or, just, the product of the ancient imagination.
Yeah.
Whereas Christianity was God acting in history, and therefore there shouldn't be this category early Christian mythology, because it's not mythology, right? This is the action of God. So people are starting from there, and the inertia of going outside of that seems impossible. And so instead of seeing Christianity born out of the fabric of antiquity, which is what you do with any other topic in the ancient world, topic, you would first look for antecedents. So any other participant that may have a more intellectually honest starting place entering that, soon enough gets swept into it.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to really be entirely liberated from that kind of gravitational center of, the whole language. The whole field is set up with a kind of language game that biases you right from the beginning to begin pursuing these questions from very specific starting places.
And this is where there's actually a really dark impulse, I think, lying behind this. And Said's work helps to expose it, because we've actually created the epistemological framework to justify Christian exclusivity. Let me say that one more time. We've actually created the epistemological framework to justify Christian exclusivity. Everybody else has mythology. We have history. Other religions have mythological texts. Our sacred texts are history. Our sacred texts are eyewitnesses. We create the methodology to study our world and make the stuff we care about unique and different. Therefore, it looks like we are always smarter than everyone else. We're always more enlightened than everyone else. Our religion has more historical gravitas. Our religion has eyewitnesses or chains of apostolic authority, and their religions have superstition. It always creates this centering of Christian thought. And then it gets a little more dangerous and a little more dark. Because what happens when your Christian worldview is rational, when biblical studies justifies that the things you do are rational and, defensible and all that sort of thing as historical truth propositions, and everyone else has superstitions, then you can, by definition, maintain the idea that other people need to be saved from those superstitions. And this was, at heart, I think, one of the chief impulses at the root of colonialism, spreading around the world with the idea of these quote-unquote savages who needed to be saved from their superstitious impulses. It's funny, I grew up in this evangelical church, and I remember frequently missionaries would come and present on the mission work that they were doing in all these far-off corners of the world. They'd come and give this tour. People were giving them money, and they would come, basically show how their money was being spent. And one of the common features of these missionary presentations was to show the weird crap that people believed and to show how we were converting them. So you would have all these stories people would tell about things people believe in other parts of the world about evil spirits and demons and different things like this. And it's so dark, and we had to bring the light of Jesus. And people never actually clued in. And to this day, there are churches all over the world that are still doing this, is that we would send people around the world to save people from their superstitions. They would come back and talk about how ridiculous other people's superstitions were. Or, maybe let's be more generous. They'd probably talk about how demonic these superstitions were. And nobody ever stopped to think it was weird that we actually believed in a story about sons of a high priest casting out a demon and that we thought that was eyewitnesses. This is the way it works in practice. And because we created this system, because we created our own epistemology that we use to study the Bible or other religions, again, we can protect our mythology and point to other people's mythology and pretend we're doing something different. So this is dark as a colonial impulse.
It's actually a colonial impulse, right? We're actually looking at a sort of Western ideological supremacy being defended. And people like Tamako Masuzawa or Talal Asad or some of these theorists have done this in religious studies as well and done it really well, that just the study of religion has this kind of colonial power impulse writ large across it. But when we look at actual biblical studies, what it actually does is it sort of preserves the superiority of our mythology. We don't even use the word mythology, but it preserves the superiority while they're superstitious. And if you actually follow that through to the natural conclusion, the really, I think, is to say we're too smart to fall for myths, essentially. We're too smart. We're too smart to actually be we believe this stuff because it's really well thought through and it's historically accurate and we have evidence and blah blah blah, but like everyone else, they have mythology, they have superstition, not us. So it's just one more sort of Western supremacy essentially, like defending itself, right?
It is in the worst possible way. Yeah, it's a kind of that we couldn't fall for this because we're special.
Yeah, exactly.
They're obvious. You could see right through every other religion in antiquity and modern time.
Yeah.
But ours is this dating and has this kind of gravitas to it and this sort of compelling historical kernel to it that you just can't escape.
Yeah.
That's all in our head.
Yeah.
Everyone else that looks at Christianity does see through it. This kind of othering and kind of the anthropological other that seems to govern kind of the strangeness of everything. And well, if you just step back, it's for lack of trying, really. All you need to do is step back 1 or 2 feet, take another look at Christianity, and you realize this is one of the weirdest things that has ever existed. So for us, all these stories just seem ultra familiar, but if you set them alongside basically any other ancient mythological framework, or like you said, the mystery religions or Eastern cults or Zoroastrianism, sometimes those other traditions, if you give them a fair run, are actually less strange.
I was looking at Acts because I've been doing some work on Acts, and of course, like everyone wants to ask about the historical accuracy of Acts, and it's like this is literally a book that the first occurrence in the book is a man flying up to heaven and angels standing there telling people like it's okay, he's coming back, and like people want to say, well, it has an accurate, there's an accurate civic government position mentioned in chapter 18 and 19, therefore this is historic, this is eyewitness account. What other text would we ever do this for? Like, how much of a benefit of the doubt can we give to a text? That's interesting for me. I think it's really fascinating to try to locate this and understand what the author knows and that sort of thing. But like, to imply that like any historical kernel here, any accurate information or verisimilitude, therefore means the whole thing is eyewitness accounts. We're lying to ourselves, right? Like we're lying to ourselves about the supremacy of our own stories and that the historical accuracy of our own stories because we made the discipline that actually makes all these judgments anyway.
Yeah, that's right. The text is springboard. It kicks off. Basically, its opening gambit is this hero flying into the sky, right?
Yeah.
And then it goes on and does have, a setting. There's various settings that are given rich, almost verisimilitudinal type detail and this kind of thing. But, that doesn't go any distance toward redeeming the text from its own modal signals right out of the gate.
Yeah.
So in ancient time, authenticating, there was this idea of authenticating when you put forward a claim that is outlandish, but you really want people to accept it with their, within their own, within their own cognitive field, and this kind of thing. If you want them to actually weigh in or weigh in their own judgment, and then you give them some sort of handles. You say, well, so-and-so saw this. You try and give them some sort of evidence for this being true. I understand this is a difficult story to swallow, but let me tell you why you probably could or should.
Yeah.
And this kind of thing. There's no effort in these texts to try and take the reader there.
Yeah.
Through their own epistemic, the normal boundaries of someone's cognitive epistemic mental discipline.
So I'm going to close by saying something that might actually surprise a lot of people. I'm okay with the New Testament being largely mythology, and I actually think that it's better when we keep it mythology. Because what happens when we try to pretend that our mythology is history, we create a world where we're better than everybody else because ours is like better thought out or whatever. What happens when we recognize that our stories are mythological is that we're on the same level as everybody else, that all of us as humans, we're doing something that all humans do. And rather than looking for this like universalizing truth, like that like cancels out all other truth in our myths, we can actually still use our mythology for meaning making. I don't think we need to obsess over whether or not they're logically true. I was thinking about this Easter because I was in church, and our church has this really incredible choir, and we're going through like all the kind of Easter stuff. And I was in tears. And it's weird because like I think a lot of the things that we think about Easter are probably mythological, but it was still incredibly powerful for me. And I was reflecting on how just because we can recognize the origins of things, just because we can recognize some things to be mythology, doesn't actually mean we can't be moved by them. And I think about the Chronicles of Narnia because I read these books all the time when I was a kid. And not once did I ever have to think, oh, these like actually were historically accurate and they actually really happened. I'm not studying them to try to get a sense of like what life was like in London in, the wartime or something like that. I'm not thinking about any of that kind of stuff. I'm fully aware it's mythology, but it's still powerful. It still moves me. And I think it's the brilliance of those books and probably those types of books in general is we know they're mythology, but it doesn't mean they're not real in a sense. It doesn't mean they're not true in a sense. And I think this gives us a very different and better way into thinking about myths. And I think we could think about this for the study of religion too, because living inside of myths gives us purpose. And I can live inside that myth without having to obsess about why it's better or why it's more important or why it beats everybody else's myths. It's just not really a good practical way of doing things. I think thinking like that gives us a lot of comfort. There's a certain like that tribalistic type of thinking that is really rooted in us probably anthropologically to want to say like we have the right God, we have the right truth, we have the best everything, like we have it all figured out. But really when you build that into a discipline, as I hope I've kind of argued, it can do a lot of damage. It can really do a lot of damage when you've created the way that you look at the world and the way that you judge everyone else's tradition. You've built the rules and then pretended your religion is more accurate or more historically trustworthy or whatever. These are deeply flawed epistemological approaches. And if we could start to unpack them, maybe people wouldn't get so mad at me for asking really interesting questions about the Bible.
When we recognize it's a myth, it puts us on the same level as everyone else. We're just the same as other humans who have myths. We're not some kind of supreme intellectuals who have actually done the hard thinking on this. It's just, these are our stories, just like other people have stories,
Yeah, and I actually don't, you might be surprised to learn that I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
Because at that point, you no longer, the thing I'm against isn't, I'm not like this hard atheist guy that's trying to just shoot down every possible, philosophical or metaphysical or spiritual kind of idea. It's more just the intellectual dishonesty in it that really, that I feel an onus to try and correct from my own.
Yeah.
And I think you have the same, we share that.
Yeah, I think so too.
We have such great conversations in society.
Yeah. Anyway.
All right,
yeah.
sir. Well,
Okay.
Hearing from you, Chris. You're
Yeah.
the best, man.
Take care, man. Talk to you soon.
Have a good weekend, sir.
You too. Bye.
I hope that was interesting to you. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I'll see you next time.